Perfect. Thank you very much, Pam. And thanks everyone for for being here and for listening to me. You don't have to listen for hours. I think I have just 10 minutes. So um that's good for all of us, I think. I don't think I want to talk for hours. That seems stressful. Um, but for the next 10 minutes, I will read from my novel, actually. Um, Shigidi and the Brass Head of Obalufon, which is actually the paperback is coming out in the UK, I believe next week on January 16th. It has a new, this is the original cover. There's a new redesigned cover that's, I think, is cooler, brighter, more fun. So if you're interested in story, you can pick that up. But in keeping with the theme for today, crafting characters, I'm going to read from an early part of the book, not the beginning, because the book itself is kind of told um, out of chronological order. So events are presented more in an emotional sense than chronological. But I will read from the earliest part, the part of the story where the main character Shigidi appears in the earliest part in the timeline, if you look at it chronologically, where he sort of first appears, even though you see him later at the beginning of the book. So this is his original state before all the adventures begin. I think it's kind of a good way to see how the character is introduced in a sense. So yeah, without further ado, I will begin. So this is chapter 5. Orisha Spirit Company, Estate 2, or Spirit Space. October 31st, 2016, 6:41 p.m. The world was spinning when Shigidi woke up. His head was pulsing like a fearful heart. When he tried to open his eyelids, the light attacked his eyes like an army of sharp red needles as his hangover began to bloom. He felt like he had been in an accident, or he had somehow become the living embodiment of an accident, and so he didn't try to move. He just lay in place, eyes shut against the world, completely motionless for what felt like hours, occasionally opening his eyes just enough to see if the world had stabilized. It hadn't. Eventually, he decided he had to get moving, or he would be unreasonably late for work, even by his own abysmally low standards. He elevated himself onto one elbow and managed to roll off the rough raffia mat that served as both bed and sitting area before he vomited a good portion of the previous day's merriment and excess onto the red clay floor of his company-assigned hut. The mess was brown and viscous, full of half-digested kola nuts, morsels of masticated meat, palm wine, and blood. Lots of blood. More than usual for a wild night out with his only drinking buddy Oshoshi, the Orisha of hunting. Shigidi retched and threw up a second wave of vomit that left him feeling slightly less terrible, but only just. After that, the world seemed a little less unstable. He summoned the will to drag himself to his feet, stumbled through the creaking wooden door, and past the brush beside his brick hut, to the hole in the ground that served as his crude latrine. He was there for what felt like days, even though it was only a few minutes, all of them spent heaving, retching, spitting. When only a clear and colorless liquid came up after each burning retch, and he felt like his inside had been scrubbed with a handful of freshly cut palm fronds. He lifted his head from the stink and darkness of the pit and looked up towards the spirit sky. The sun hung low, and there were no clouds, just a series of blue and red and yellow streaks, broad and blurring into and out of each other's edges, making it look like a silk sheet had been generously tied and dyed by an artist and spread out above them in the sky. On the horizon, though, where the spirit sky met the ground beyond the forest that marked the company compound. A halo of blue ringed the spirit world. It was beautiful, Shigidi had to admit. Every day, the spirit sky took on a new appearance, and this one was particularly impressive. He turned away and spat out a final glob of phlegm before standing on his small and steady feet and muttering under his breath, "If only Olorun spent half as much time paying attention to company business as he did playing games with the colors of the heavens, maybe the spirit company wouldn't be in such a mess." The Orishas of the spirit company all knew that Olorun was their vain, aloof, and leisurely sky god, but Shigidi had always felt an affinity with and admiration for Olorun, even though he'd never met his creator. And his initial admiration was slowly morphing into resentment. He still desperately wished that the retired chairman of the board of what used to be one of the largest spirit companies in existence would care enough about the organization he had left fallow to check in on them every once in a while. Instead, Olorun had allowed the company to degenerate in his absence. Now Shigidi felt unmotivated, uninterested in executing any of the tasks required as a condition of his godhood in the Orisha Spirit Company. But he still had to go to work, else he would weaken and eventually die. Or perhaps worse, he'd have to answer to the more powerful Orisha that managed the company. Godhood is overrated. He staggered and stumbled his way to the back of the hut, where a crude clay enclosure with an entrance covered by palm fronds marked his bath area. He stripped off his filthy Ankara print trousers and left them, then grabbed a half-cut calabash floating on the filmy surface of a bucket of still water. He dumped a bowl full of water on his head, and as it ran down his body, he slowly began to feel like himself again. At least as much of himself as he could be with a terrible hangover. He scrubbed his rough, calloused hands over his skin, trying to make himself decently clean, and wiped away most of the grime and dirt without thinking too much about the pockmarks, rashes, scarification lines, and sores that he was always acutely aware of whenever he touched his skin. Ugliness was a part of his nature, an essential trait for his job, however it made him feel. What use would the beautiful nightmare god be? No, repulsiveness was a requirement for his position in Spirit Company, and even though he desperately hated his job, the dreary, uninteresting, mundane, and occasionally traumatizing tasks he had to execute under the supervision of gods he hated, in exchange for barely enough prayers and offerings to keep him in existence. Every deity had to do what they could to survive in these hard times. Belief was scarce, good offerings were few and far between, and almost every god he knew had already taken a prayer cut, unless, of course, they were friends with the CEO or in upper management. When the bucket was empty, he went back into his hut, naked and dripping, enjoying the feel of the evening air on his wet skin. Inside, he ignored the rotting smell of the slimy mess on the floor and started to ready himself for work. He could clean up later. No one ever visited him anyway. He dressed quickly, another pair of cut-off Ankara print trousers to fit his short and stocky legs. These ones, orange and green, with hints of brown. A plain black cloak that sat on his shoulders and ran down to the back of his ankles, with cowrie shells and lizard skulls sewn into the fabric, and his face covered with black ash to complete his fearful appearance. By the time he stepped out of the hut again, the sky was a deep and abiding black, shimmering with stars and a brightly beaming moon, like bedazzling. He sighed heavily. Bloody waste of power. It only took him a few minutes to walk to the end of the Spirit Company residential area and connect to the bush path that snaked through the spirit shadow of the now defunct evil forest. He stepped off the moonlit road and into the darkness of the path. The wet, woody smell of the towering trees and fallen leaves and peaty soil wrapped itself around him as the underbrush crunched beneath his bare feet, and loose twigs snapped along his ankles. The evil forest, diminished as it was, still greeted him in the ancient way, with the whisper of wind and the murmuring of wild creatures. Its power significantly muted since most of the spirits it once housed had been displaced. Its sacred deities long gone. He thought he saw a pair of cherubic abiku, their small, child-shaped bodies silhouetted against the moon-polished stream that flowed at the far end of the forest. They were playing a game he did not recognize. They disappeared when he blinked, and he doubted his own perception, wondering just how drunk he still was. Shayona bastard, he said out loud, and continued walking along the shortcut, remembering that Oshoshi, the hunter Orisha, and one of the few gods he considered a friend, had told him over a calabash of palm wine that the Orisha Spirit Company board had voted to cut down the evil forest and make a way for a shrine to cinema. It was a shame, but they had to pander to what few customers were left, Oshoshi had said. And Shigidi understood. At least he thought he did. It was another depressing change, but that was the way the spirit business was going. Evil forests are out, Nollywood is in. Fate is a funny thing. Shigidi kept walking and didn't exit until the verdant curtain of forest finally gave way to a clearing at the end of the path. He stepped into the moonlight, only a few hundred meters away from the entrance of his office. Like many other minor Orishas, he walked out of his satellite office, and this one was a two-story red brick building older than he was, with 6 square windows facing out and a black sloping roof. Impossibly, he thought. It looked even worse than he remembered from just 2 days earlier, when he had collected his last month's pay, most of which he had spent on everything he had just thrown up. A new hole had appeared in the front wall beside the door, and another wooden window pane had slipped from its place to hang precariously over the overgrown grass that surrounded the compound. The lights were out. Shigidi couldn't tell if it was because no one was there or if because the power supply had been cut again. He sighed, and his shoulders fell as he made his way to the door, sauntering through the curtain of hanging beads and into the reception area, standing in a thin sliver of moonlight that entered through another broken window. Shigidi, the shrill, high-pitched voice of Oya, the Orisha of winds, and his recently appointed supervisor, assaulted his ears with unexpected suddenness, and when it hit his still hungover brain, he winced. "You're late," she added, a bit less loudly. All right. I think I'll stop there for now.